Firstly, thanks for Keith and the IEU for giving me an opportunity to speak. Apologies that I'm not actually doing this live. At the time of you watching this, I'll be hopefully in Cambodia and hopefully in the chat of this discussion group, depending on the reliability of the internet, so apologies for that. So I'm going to break this down into three sort of main chunks. The system level issues that Gabbie and her book discussed and explored, the individual concerns that she presents and the utility of these ideas, and then finally for a moment I'll touch on the sort of system level and what I would propose as solutions, though obviously I'm just one teacher in one setting. So in the last chat, Gabbie suggested that the core issue for the whole system was standardization. I think there's some real truth to that in one aspect, but I think it's worth breaking down into more detail than that, just because standardization doesn't really directly cover teaching approaches, for example, though she would suggest that they do. And obviously it's mostly focused around testing, where the use of the word standardization is most common. So I'd like to sort of explore that out a little bit more. I think the core issue is workload and time. That might not entirely be true for Gabbie in her primary school setting, or in her previous job of her primary school setting, where it is pretty much 24/7, you're on the ball, you're face-to-face teaching, you're interacting with students for the entire time, the entire duration. In a high school setting, that's not too far from the truth, but it's obviously lesser than a primary school. But if you look at sort of PISA numbers, Australia's in the top 5 or the top 6 in terms of face-to-face teaching, and therefore also workload. Obviously teachers still need to prepare and they need to get their work done and they need to assess students as well, and all of those things require time. And so the more that you're actually in front of students, either you have two options, you're assessing when you should be teaching, which is not best practice obviously, or you're just doing that in your own time. And Gabbie's story and novel really clearly covered that, and the ways that she was constantly in need of doing more work. I think the best way to think of it is that teaching is basically a bottomless pit. If you wanted to, you could invest all of the time in the world into a single class even, and perfecting that before delivering it, even if it was just for an hour or so. And that's definitely true for the amount of face-to-face teaching hours that we've got. So ultimately, workload needs to be minimized by our system, at the system level, and also at the level of leadership within schools. But as it currently occurs, leadership within schools has to work within such narrow bounds that they basically can't do almost anything effective based on the expectations within our society and within our system. One other factor that's really significant, we are among sort of, again to go to PISA data, OECD data rather, we are among sort of the most professionally developed teachers comparatively to other nations within the study. But also a lot of that professional development is what we would consider poor quality, in the sense that it's direct address, conference style things rather than coaching, ongoing communities of practice, professional learning communities, professional learning networks, whatever you might want to call them. And so what that means basically is that I feel as a profession we are being deprofessionalized by stealth. So external presenters, people with university degrees come in, they talk to us rather than with us, they talk at us rather than with us, and they, by so doing, take away some autonomy, take away a lot of voice, and as such they deprofessionalize us by stealth. Then testing in and of itself isn't something terrible, but when you make a standardized test that is by definition not sensitive to teaching, you're not actually testing the teaching, you're just ranking students. And as soon as you start to rank anything, you're making it less human. And luckily in Australia at least, we don't directly rank teachers, but it's clear that that sort of thinking could be applied to teachers eventually, and this is something that the unions have to directly challenge. Just as a small side note, I think one of the elements of this issue is that people often talk about teaching as a science, or typically the metaphor used is medicine, when in actual fact it should remain and be considered, at least within the broader sphere, as an art. And Gabbie sort of talks about that, the way that it's about building relationships which are in and of themselves not scientific, and an understanding of students' backgrounds, students' needs, and a whole range of factors, rather than simply delivering best possible methodology and curriculum directly to the students. And then just lastly, all of these issues sort of culminate in initial teacher education, in the sense that they are overly theoretical, overly scientific, overly data driven. It's all about being visible, being clear, being scientific, making assumptions, hypotheses, and then proving them. And that in itself is why I believe there's such a great turnover between the first 5 years. Some would say 30, 40, 50%, depending on what studies you hear. But that is the core issue. They're overly theoretical, there's not enough placements occurring, and there's not enough of a bridge between the theory and the practice. And that is just one example that Gabbie touched on in her book, in the way that these complicated forces all sort of coalesce into initial teacher education, and then you get the sort of first year shock once you actually get into the practicum and you realise that these two things that you've been talking about are completely separate and completely distinct. So just in terms of Gabbie's personal story itself, I feel it's almost worth giving this novel to early career teachers and people considering joining the teaching profession, because though I agree with a lot of her big picture complaints, NAPLAN, standardisation, deprofessionalisation is true, one aspect of that I think we need to be especially wary of is sort of internalising these ideas and making ourselves ineffective and leading towards burnout. So as I read the book, I found it very personally challenging, and not for any other reason but because everything she said I found and could relate to within my own practice and my own belief systems, and these are things that I had to constantly challenge within myself. So the thing that sticks out as most problematic was the fact that she didn't go to professional development, as she said, sort of that left too much of an impact on the kids, and that also impacted on the sort of the learning program when she came back and all the issues that were associated with that. I think that's all of the things I'm about to mention sort of led to what I think of as a sense of isolation, which led in turn to the burnout and herself leaving the profession. So these four things: avoiding PD, seeing the leadership as separate to what teachers are doing, seeing policy as largely disconnected from that as well, and then finally seeing the job as unique. Those four things to me sort of added up to the sense of isolation and sort of alone solitariness of teaching. And in my personal opinion, the only thing that makes teaching really worth doing is the collaboration that teachers have, whether it be team teaching or any sort of group collaboration. And that's sort of where we draw our energy from, as well as from engaging with the young people that we teach. But a really core part of that is collaboration. And so throughout the book, we sort of felt we could see Gabbie disconnect from these networks, and I feel like that was, at least in part, an aspect to sort of leading to her leaving the profession. And then just to finally bring it back to sort of what I would suggest as the solutions, not surprisingly, since we're all here as part of the IEU's work, I think a lot of the solutions that need to occur for our system to really be improved, and I would say our system has excellence across the board, but that this excellence isn't spread out and that there's pockets of excellence rather than people sharing their practice, and the core issue behind that is that there's not enough time. So if all the schools in Victoria, say, or New South Wales or any state could actually spend time together, moderate some work, share some resources, share approaches, I think we could very possibly, without necessarily spending more money but reducing teacher and face-to-face time, we could actually dramatically improve outcomes. So having said that, I would agree in part with Gabbie in the sense that the policy isn't necessarily doing what we need it to do, and the solution I would see in this current climate at least is largely dependent upon the union. So we require the union to be a conduit between professional organisations, sort of key governance bodies, AIDSL and so forth, and the actual on the ground, in the classroom teachers. So they're the conduit in the sense that I think it's the job of a union to find voices and to promote those, to develop those, to spend money taking teachers out of their natural classroom setting and sort of getting them to become more, I would think of it as an adult among adults, rather than too often we have the sense that teachers are sort of children trapped in kind of adult teacher clothes or something. And I think that's sort of, as a profession, something that we need to struggle against, and the union has a big role in finding those voices, promoting them, upskilling them, developing them, and then finally getting them onto the boards that we need them to be involved in to actually have a policy impact. And as part of that, what we require from the unions is for them to become modernised and to explore spaces beyond merely the industrial. I think the IEU is doing a really great job of this with things like this initiative, but making it modernised, actually discussing pedagogy, working conditions, and moving beyond simply sort of pay rates and contract agreements and those sort of things, and really involving the teachers in the way that a professional or a sort of subject specific organisation might. Alright, those are my thoughts. Thanks for having me on.